Hey guys, welcome to the Hypertrophy Hustle Show. So this week I'm speaking to Clif Harvey. So Clif's a really good nutritionist here in Auckland, New Zealand. Surprisingly enough, one of the few people that I found in Auckland that's really, really good. So Clif, with all of this stuff, what I found really cool about your work is the way people will commonly with keto, they won't give it a fair chance. They won't sort of actually look at the realities of it. They won't look at the actual useful applications of it. And I think people will find out about it, either completely see it as the best thing ever, or they will completely see it as not useful in any situation. And it's a bit, I'd say it's completely black and white thinking, just all over the place with this. And you've been one of the people that's sort of taken it and actually applied it for a long time in a much more reasonable way. So in terms of this whole approach, how you would outline it, I don't know if you would use the word keto or you use the word low carb or anything like that, but how would you what place do you see it having in nutrition? What place do you see the general way it should be used?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I like the way you've framed that, because I think first and foremost, we need to understand that keto is an important intervention to have access to, right? It's one of the various tools that we can have in our toolkit as a clinical nutritionist. Now, I think a lot of the criticism of keto has come about for two major reasons. One is that there was such an ingrained dogma for such a long time of the dangers of fat, the dangers of saturated fat, the primacy of carbohydrate. And that was applied almost carte blanche across all populations. And so there still seems to be a bit of a sort of rearguard action from a lot of the very orthodox traditionalists around macronutrients. Now, we also had a movement, which is really interesting to me because I felt like I was part of it, a movement that came about through the 90s where particularly people started looking at protein. And protein, I think, was really kicking things off in the 90s at least, where people were reimagining how protein should be consumed in the diet, how much protein we should have. And so now you see a lot of the people who are very, prodigious researchers, they're very well known in the field, who tout the benefits of protein. Now, interestingly to me, a lot of those people are also very anti-keto. And it's because it probably just isn't in their wheelhouse, right? If we're talking about hypertrophy, for example, is keto going to be the most appropriate thing for someone who's looking for maximal hypertrophy? Probably not. Now, it can be for some, but it's probably not the best intervention for most people most of the time. So because it has limitations there, and it perhaps has some limitations for athletes, and we can discuss that because I think the limitations are also misunderstood. But because there are some limitations there, people sort of say, well, it's stupid to do keto. Where I sit is interesting because I do come from a performance background. I started off at AUT with fitness training. It's well known that I was kicked out of nutrition class at AUT for questioning the dogma. I then went off and did weird things. I, did my undergrad in naturopathy. I did my early postgrad in mind body healthcare and circled back to nutrition, even though I practiced as a nutritional specialist for a long time, circled back to nutrition for my master's and doctorate. And so basically now we have this interesting situation where I feel like I started in performance, but I ended up very quickly in the clinical setting, working with people with pathology. So we're working with people with clinical conditions. And when we start to look at that, it's undeniable that keto has some very pronounced benefits for particular populations. So getting down to the nitty gritty, I think that not just keto, but keto/low carb, so the whole low carb spectrum is, in my opinion, undeniably the best intervention for people with diabetes. Right, I think that's clear from the evidence, and I think it would be very hard for people to dispute that unless they've got a real vested interest in something else, like maybe a high-carb vegan diet, which is where a lot of the criticism in that space comes from. I think we're also seeing really interesting emerging research around the role of keto specifically for neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, Huntington's disease. And also the use of ketogenic diets for post-concussion, traumatic brain injury, things like that. So we have some really interesting areas. We've got one, diabetes and metabolic syndrome, where it's pretty clear. We've got one where it's really promising and, in my opinion, as a clinician, worth using because, let's face it, the survival times for for people after diagnosis of something like Alzheimer's is pretty low, 6 to 9 years, I think, on average. And so, worth using something that has fairly good evidence behind it. And also some other emerging areas like in the treatment of cancer. Now, that's another area that's very polarizing. You particularly see this within, debates at the ISSN Facebook page and things, where some people will be, strongly keto for cancer, and others will say you're mad, keto basically drives cancer. The truth is probably in between. And the reality is that we don't understand all of the ramifications, which is why, I do a lot of education on keto for cancer. And my education is predominantly cautionary. It's that, yes, it probably does offer prodigious benefits for some patients. We've certainly seen quite amazing clinical results in some cases, but there is caution needs to be exercised because cancer is not a homogeneous disease. It's not the same between people. It's not the same between different cancer types, and even cancer cells within the same body are not the same. So we need to exercise some caution and basically look within all of these areas at an individualized prescription for the person and what their desired outcome is. So I guess, to cut a long story short, that's why I call my whole approach carb appropriate, because it's about trying to find the amount of carbohydrate or the nutrition style that's going to work best for the individual without getting hung up on the dogma.
Yeah, I think that's a really cool approach, because it's like, I haven't heard anyone who I know is really intelligent about this kind of stuff. They're never saying definite values. Like, they're never saying you need exactly this amount of carbs per day, or this is the minimum you want to have. Like, it's always a range, and it's like there's usually there's no sort of vast generalizations. Like, it's a lot more broad. And I think it's cool what you pointed out. It's sort of like, yeah, there's limitations in some cases, but that does not mean it's completely useless. Like all these specific cases, it can be really, really useful. And then even if you go into the cancer side of it, which I know absolutely nothing about, it's like, okay, maybe in specific types of cancer or specific different, methods of it or something like that, that's when it can be really appropriate, which is really cool. And so that's one of the things that, because for me, it's kind of like something I've been absolutely fascinated by is diabetes, right? It's like, it's just one of the scariest diseases ever. And it's so common, like it's just ridiculously prominent. And it's like, we're just in an environment where diabetes is more prominent than it was in the past. And it's just becoming more prominent. And it's like, I can't see the argument for not a ketogenic diet for diabetes. Like I'm struggling to find the argument for it. Do you think, in terms of diabetes, where do you see the general sort of role of low carbohydrate diets? Like, where do you think the limitations are? Do you think it's for everyone, or where do you think for a diabetic, type 2 diabetic patient, or even type 1 diabetic, do you think that sort of, it's pretty much unanimously a pretty damn good idea?
I think so, with some caution. And the caution would be that I don't think it always needs to be keto. I think by the same token, though, I think we get hung up on the distinction between keto and what's otherwise low carb. Mainly because I think with the idea of keto, people still fall into the trap of classifying keto as the old school, studied for over 100 years, classic ketogenic diet that came about to treat kids with epilepsy, right? And that has to be, by nature of what it's trying to achieve, it has to be far more restrictive than what we would consider a modern iteration of the keto diet, either for the support of health, or maybe for some people for performance, or in this case, for the treatment of diabetes. Because really the key is that it's pretty clear when we look at the evidence. There's been systematic reviews, meta-analyses published on this, and they've shown that a low-carb diet results in around 150% greater reduction in HbA1c. So what we're basically seeing there is a far better effect on blood glucose levels. We're seeing a far better effect on blood glucose control. Now, that's the outcome we want with diabetes. So it's very clear. Now, does it need to be keto? Not necessarily. But on the other hand, what is keto versus low carb? Like, if we look at it in a really simple sense, for a lot of my clients, I'm just saying, okay, rule number one is we want to eat natural unprocessed food, right? almost all the time. Sure, we're going to have our treats. There's no problem with that. But we want to basically eat natural unprocessed food. If we're doing that and we want to restrict carbohydrate, what's the easiest way to do it? Well, we just avoid obligate carbs. So in other words, we're avoiding, sugar, grains, fruit, still allowing some berries, and the tubers like kumara, potatoes, whatnot. So really within that context, we've got meat, we've got a lot of vegetables, we've got healthy fats. Some people might say, well, it's not keto unless you can restrict your carbs to X amount of grams per day. But I would say in most cases, people avoiding obligate carbs will achieve what we consider to be nutritional ketosis, right? And nutritional ketosis, for the nerds out there, is considered nowadays to be equal to or greater than 0.5 millimoles per liter of beta-hydroxybutyrate in the blood, right? That doesn't really mean much apart from the fact that you've got a certain amount of ketone, which can help to supply the fuel shortfall for the brain and the central nervous system. So, do we need to get more complex than that? Probably not. And particularly for diabetes, and, whether it be type 1 or type 2, then that's typically sufficient to drastically reduce blood glucose. And in the case of type 1 diabetes, that also then means that there's a drastic reduction in insulin usage. That's a caution for people as well, because if you are type 1 diabetic and you want to go on a low-carb or keto diet, you've got to be monitored. So, you've got to be monitored in those early stages so that you're not using too much insulin and going into hypoglycemia or, that really low blood sugar level. But, you mentioned how prevalent it is nowadays. It's more prevalent than people think as well, because when we consider that we're not just talking anymore about type 1 diabetes, we're not just talking about type 2 diabetes, we're also talking about metabolic syndrome, which came about in the 90s and they called it Syndrome X. People didn't really know what the heck it was. But now we're seeing that even that metabolic syndrome, metabolic disorder, is broader than people thought. Because if you go to the doctor and you get a few blood tests done and it might indicate that you're maybe on the pathway to diabetes, that's really where we'd consider metabolic syndrome. But if we're testing people in a more comprehensive way, where we're, say, challenging them with glucose and then measuring their insulin and glucose responses to that challenge, we can see a whole range of effects that indicate that people still aren't, utilizing carbohydrate, storing carbohydrate effectively. They're still in a state of metabolic disorder. So what I'm really getting at there, to cut a long story short, is that the numbers of people with metabolic disorder are probably a heck of a lot higher than people previously recognized.
And I think that's the frightening thing, frankly. It's like, especially with metabolic syndrome, it's like, okay, you have this situation where like a large majority of people don't live a lifestyle that's nearly conducive to health. And it's like, it's not their fault. It's just you live in an environment where literally every food you eat is going to be like delicious and it's easy to overconsume. And then you sit at your desk job and you don't want to move. And then you get home and you're exhausted because your job is stressful. And then you don't want to move. So you don't go to the gym, you don't lift weights, whatever. You don't go for a walk. Like, it's a really frightening situation. And I think, would you sort of say, in terms of keto, this is one of the things that initially sort of made me think like, okay, we should not just dismiss keto. Like it's obviously going to have some utility, because I've seen just in my friends, like these guys have no knowledge about nutrition. I'm not guiding them and they've lost weight using keto. And it's like, okay, I think that there's caution to be used there, because obviously there's better approaches than just saying use keto, obviously. But it's like, do you think the mechanism that keto can have on like hunger signals and sort of general satiety, do you feel as though it's if you combine just the change in macronutrients with the generally eating less processed food, is like a generally pretty damn good mechanism, is literally just its effect on hunger signals? Or would you say, is there other mechanisms at play?
There's potentially other mechanisms at play, but I think with most of these interventions, the key is energy balance, right? As much as that makes me sound like an old school person, and I get messages whenever I do a podcast and I talk about energy balance. People message me and say, don't you know that a calorie is not a calorie? Yeah, I do know that. I kind of get it. But just because the second law of thermodynamics applies doesn't mean the first doesn't, right? And we still need to look at energy balance. So basically the reason why a lot of interventions work is because it helps people to auto-regulate their energy.
Right.
And, you probably know that Eric Helms and I talk about this a lot. We've discussed this in workshops and podcasts and things. This idea of auto-regulation is not just about how we auto-regulate training. Auto-regulation is really interesting when it comes to how much we eat. And from my point of view, anything that can help someone to auto-regulate how much they eat rather than them having to consciously determine portion control and calorie balance through an app or whatever it happens to be is probably going to be positive. Now, notwithstanding, some people are still going to benefit from portion control and some people are going to benefit by, app-based nutrition planning, whatever it happens to be. It doesn't really matter how people get there so long as they can get there. And so this is what's missing from a lot of the discussion is if keto allows someone to be satiated and to eat an appropriate amount of energy, and they're also eating natural unrefined food and lots of veggies, which I still think is very important, then, hey, it's going to work, right? So why on earth would we be, discussing whether it's the perfect plan for X reason or the worst plan for another reason? Because when we look at it on balance, the effect size between different diets, assuming that energy balance can be maintained, is very small.
Yeah, I think that's the very cool part. Like I just had Stefan Guyane on as well, and it's like his whole thing around. It's like it's pretty much like so for a while, right? I was that guy who was like calories, and then I was like, but the thing is, like, it's like we need to know how to get to that point. It's like you can tell someone calories matter, and then it doesn't mean shit. Like it doesn't. It's not going to do a thing. It's one of the things where it's kind of like it's really like it seems like one of those things. Once you learn it, you're like, oh my god, calories, and then you want to just tell everyone that, but it doesn't do jack shit. And then it's the mechanisms that get you there that I think are the much more important part, as you outlined. Like the things you can eat, the way you can set up your nutrition, the way you can set up your lifestyle, that can put you in a position where you can achieve that.
Talking about Stefan, and I think it's brilliant, but it alludes to something also interesting in nutrition, where we have a debate seemingly between bottom-up versus top-down nutrition scientists, right?
Yeah.
So we have top-down nutrition scientists who sort of say, well, it's all about the brain and it's all about the signaling from the brain. And then you have bottom-up nutrition scientists or maybe even nutrition journalists who will basically say it's all about the body and the chemical signals, in particular insulin and its effect on leptin and ghrelin, blah, 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 all this kind of stuff. So we've almost got these contrasting beliefs, but we would have to consider that it's not either or, it's both.
Yeah.
And so in terms of satiety, this is interesting because satiety can be looked at in different ways as well. Often satiety is measured in studies by giving people a particular meal and then having various surveys, questionnaires, or maybe some quantified measures taken after that meal, which is super interesting and it's very informative. But there's another way to look at it as well, which is equally informative, which is just to feed people particular foods and then see what they eat overall. So let's see what they eat over days, weeks, or months as a result of following a particular thing. Now, sometimes people don't necessarily feel or recognize satiety after a meal from eating particular things, but hey, lo and behold, they end up eating either more or less. And we certainly see this with, low carb or keto, or even just diets that are really based around natural unprocessed food, where people tend to auto-regulate more effectively. So that's almost the bottom-up approach to satiety. But we also need to consider, as you mentioned, food environment, psychosocial environment, and how we interact with that. That comes from within, it comes from without, and that's basically our psychosocial conditioning, which drives our behaviors. Now, for some people, actually, I'd probably say for more people on balance, low carb actually works more effectively because it's easier for them behaviorally to simply omit certain things and have that sort of abstinence versus moderation philosophy. I discussed that in a qualitative paper we put out based on some of our keto research. Whereas some other people are, we would say they're more of the moderated behavioral type. And they really like to have moderation. They like to control their portions, and they can actually do that very easily. So a massive part of what is going to be most effective for people isn't even necessarily what's supposedly best for their physiology. It's just what they can do behaviorally.
And I think that's the most important thing. It's kind of like we get stuck up on, okay, which one is best on paper? Kind of doesn't matter. What matters is like, say, for instance, one of my friends, she tried everything. Then she did keto. It worked for her. And then everyone was telling her all the time, don't do it. Oh my God, so bad. Like everyone's just in her ear telling her it doesn't work, blah, blah, blah. And it's just like, okay, she can stick to it though. She finds it very easy. She did it like without anyone else helping her. And it's like, that's cool. It could have been anything else though. And it's like, that's the thing. I would like to go back though. So one of the things you mentioned, which I thought was intriguing, and it's like, it's one of those things where people are always like, anytime you mention calories and nutrition, people are like, everyone sort of like perks up, gets on their seat. So one of the things you mentioned was in terms of sort of a calorie is not a calorie. When you say that, what would you be able to sort of clarify or sort of outline your position there? Because I think, I think it's easy for people to misinterpret what that might mean.
Absolutely. So it's true to say that a calorie is a calorie, right? And that the energy quotient we get from the liberation of energy from these foods that we take in is consistent, right? We do take in 4 calories per gram from carbohydrate and protein, roughly. I know it does vary. And similarly, it varies a little bit, somewhere around 9 calories per gram for different fats and lipids that we might take in. That is true. But we need to also consider what are the functional endpoints for those things, right? There are other effects as well, like how easily are they absorbed and utilized? What effect, if any, do they have on the microbiome differentially? But most importantly, I think when we're looking at it in a very simple way, is what are the functional endpoints? Now, that's important because we need to recognize the roles of the nutrients when we are talking about energy, right? When we're talking about energy, we also need to recognize what the functional roles of these nutrients are. And we could obviously quickly summarize those. Well, protein is predominantly providing for structure in the body. It's amino acids that we build into stuff. Fat is predominantly providing structural components and energy, whereas carbohydrate that we consume at least is predominantly energy provision. So there's going to be a certain amount of protein, amino acids. There's going to be a certain amount of lipids that we require to build things. So the functional endpoints of those are going to be quite different to, say, carbohydrate. And that's important to realize, not because we're trying to push a low-carb barrow here, but purely because when we look at the differential effects of different diets, there is an effect, for example, of increasing the protein content of your diet. If you increase the protein content of your diet proportionately, even if it retains the same amount of energy or the same amount of calories, you will probably gain some muscle, you will probably lose some body fat, right? That's well known and that's not controversial. So that just shows that while a calorie is a calorie, in terms of nutrition, calories from different things mean different things depending on where they're eventually going to end up.
Yeah, I think that.
Now, also, sorry, one other thing, I didn't mean to cut you off, is that also the effect of different foods on satiety is critically important, because then we start to have a secondary effect whereby it's actually exerting its overall effect through the effect on energy balance. So again, if we just talk about protein, for example, if we increase the proportion of protein in our diet, typically that tends to be more satiating and we're less likely to overeat. So a calorie is a calorie on one hand, but then it's certainly not on another, because the different macronutrients have different effects within the body, both psychoneurophysiologically and on an endpoint physiological basis.
Yeah, I would say, from my knowledge of nutrition, I would say I agree. I mean, my knowledge of nutrition is pretty limited compared to the kind of people that I talk to. But it's like, Yeah, I think that's a really cool way to put it, because I think with anything, like you mentioned calories to literally anyone and they have an opinion. It's you don't even have to say anything about it. You just say the word calorie and people's ears perk up, which I find is interesting and fascinating and confusing. But
that's a reaction to calorie obsession that we had through the 80s and 90s. I mean, people are either fully on board and it's become part of their lore, I guess, of nutrition, is that they really want to know the energy, the calories and things. And other people, particularly, if they've maybe had some challenges with yo-yo dieting or, haven't really been able to do that very well, as a lot of people can't, then they develop almost a fear and a resistance to even discussing it. But, if we just take the fear and the emotion out of it and just discuss these things objectively, that actually puts us in a really strong position. And I think that's why we need to remove a lot of the scaremongering, the fear, around all aspects of nutrition.
I completely agree. Like it's been cool to see kind of like the bodybuilding community be less calorie focused. Like obviously most of bodybuilders are going to be like, calories, I'm going to always track my macros, blah, blah, blah. But then you get someone like Eric, right? Like when he did his bodybuilding prep, he I believe, I don't want to misquote what he did here, but I don't think he tracked for a long portion of it. I think he only tracked near the very end. And I think it was just really cool because it's like, okay, look at this auto-regulation. He's just basically auto-regulating the whole way through his prep until the end. And then afterwards, same exact thing. He's just sort of approaching it from a much more mindful perspective. And now, like, I found it sort of took me aback a little bit when I started having more conversations about this stuff, as I realized, oh shit, calories aren't the end all be all. And that's like for literally everything. It's kind of like assumed knowledge early on that thermodynamics matters, but then it doesn't, like, clinically, it doesn't matter if you know that or not. Like you could get rid of that piece of information and it kind of doesn't change much. Like it's kind of this assumption we all have to start with, but it's like if you just obsess about that forever, it doesn't really matter. Like if you try to treat obesity by just thinking about calories, you're missing the point, I'd say.
Absolutely. And I think it takes the focus off, number one, where the focus should be. And number two, probably what we can all agree on is that we actually need a broadly nutrient dense diet to live, not just have the longest lifespan, but have the longest health span within that lifespan, right? And so I think when we overly obsess about energy, calories, and we overly obsess about the macro quotient of our diet, I often, even though maybe this isn't technically correct, maybe there's been some research around this, I'll often say, if it fits your macros, great, but it may not fit your micros, because I think we lose track of that nutrient density that's so critically important. And I think now we're only just beginning to open the doors to some of that greater understanding around the knowledge of secondary nutrients and things. People were so obsessed in the 80s and 90s about antioxidants.
Yeah.
And now we know that maybe a lot of that stuff that we were talking about, is the whole oxidation bogeyman really as big an issue as we thought? Probably not. But are there other interesting things that we're getting from those antioxidant molecules or other similar signaling molecules from plants? Probably. And most of this is being shown in animal research at this stage, but we're getting to the point now where we're also starting to translate some of those animal findings into functional outcome studies in humans. And hey, at the end of the day, is there anything wrong with eating more vegetables? Probably not.
Exactly. Like I can't see, there's literally no downsides except like,
unless you're a carnivore dieter, and then you'll be very against it.
Then you wouldn't be too keen on it. I think that's the one we can all kind of be like, okay, no, mate.
Well, carnivore dieting is an interesting one because I think similarly to the keto sort of resurgence, I guess, in the late 90s when I, got into it, and through the whole low carb revival, there have been some interesting questions asked. And I think that's important because if that hadn't have happened, although a lot of people are way too extreme in their views of keto, it did cause inconvenient questions to be asked and then begin to be answered in the research. The carnivore diet similarly is showing, it's asking some questions which I think are really interesting. Now, do I think carnivore dieting is the best thing for most people most of the time? No way. Just based on the evidence, I don't think so. I could be proven wrong, but hey, I'm happy to be proven wrong. But does it work for some people? It appears to work really well for some people. Will it work for them in the long term? I just don't know. But hey, it's worth asking the questions and, looking at it as a scientist should.
Yeah.
What's the hypothesis? How can we test that? Is it plausible? And if so, if there's plausibility there, what's the mechanism? How can we study it? How can we, investigate all of this to understand more about nutrition on a whole?
I completely agree. Like, it's kind of like, it's like with a vegan diet, right? At the start, when you hear about it, you're like, that's ridiculous. We need blah, blah, blah. And then more and more as time has gone on, we've been like, okay, there's a reasonable and an unreasonable way to take this approach. Like,
yeah,
it really depends. There's bad of everything. Like, no matter what diet you do, you can get a bad version of it. Like, look at the typical bodybuilding diet. Like, I can literally just drink apple juice and say that I'm fitting my macros or whatever, or just apple juice and protein shakes. It's like, but is that conducive to a decent diet? Probably not. Like, there's not a single vegetable in this protein shake. Like, it's, probably not. I would say not the most appropriate idea.
It's really interesting when we periodically will sort of poll, every few years, maybe every 5 years or so, we'll poll our clients and colleagues and things as to what their, and this is just very informal, so this is not publishable or anything like that, but it's just very informal, mainly for our business, for our college and things like that, what their biggest concerns in say, health and performance are. And I think the shift has been really interesting, because if we go back to the late 90s when I started practicing, it was pretty much fat loss was the biggest thing. Maybe fat loss, muscle gain, it was very much the aesthetic side was overwhelmingly what most people were interested in. Now, I'm not saying that's not the case now, but certainly in our more recent polls of our clients and colleagues, it's been much more geared towards other things like energy levels. I want better energy through the day. Or another interesting thing that's sprung up in, say, the last 10 years or so is a lot of people are saying, I want better brain health and I want to preserve brain health, mainly because maybe they've been exposed to a relative with Alzheimer's or something like that.
Yeah.
Now, I think that shift towards a more health and health span focus for people, I think is really positive. And I think that's starting to translate through into, even bodybuilding. I think a lot of people are really, interestingly, I used to be involved in all-round weightlifting back in the day, of course. So I lifted weights for New Zealand as an all-round weightlifter, which is basically the old form of weightlifting. And I've been really interested now to see guys like Eric and other people who are fairly prominent in bodybuilding get, become attached again to the physical culture movement, which is an older movement, but it's one that's a little bit more holistic, I guess, in the true sense of the word holism, where people are actually looking at being a better functioning, strong human individual.
Yeah, I think people a while ago, right, they would you would say functional fitness or anything around that and people would take the piss out of it, but it's kind of like,
because a lot of functional fitness was stupid.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? But it's like, for instance, I have scoliosis. So I had a S-shaped spine, and then they fixed it with metal and all that, and like a bunch of big surgery. And for me, it's like, I love bodybuilding. I truly do. I really love bodybuilding. Like, hypertrophy, it's literally my favorite thing. Like, I just love it. But it's like, if I'm doing that and feeling like shit the whole time, not a good idea. Like, I had to learn more about hypertrophy to make it, one, more hypertrophy, but two, like, I don't feel terribly injured the whole time. And it's like, for instance, I've just been enjoying doing, like, for instance, ever since I finished my exams, which would have been like 20 days ago or something like that. Yeah, 21 days ago. I've literally just been fucking around at the gym, doing whatever I want to. Like, I can't clean and jerk, definitely not. I've tried so damn hard. It's one of the hardest things ever. But just doing things that I don't normally do, just for the fun of it, and just because I want to do it and it feels good. Like, it's really cool to see this whole, like, the whole kind of community seems to generally be not just in this idiotic pursuit of hypertrophy. Like, everyone's being a bit more reasonable. We're not just pursuing that with no other thought, I guess. Like, people, for instance, you'll have people, like, one of the people you might know, Shannon Beer. She talks a lot about sort of getting away from figuring out when tracking is useful, but then also getting away from tracking and figuring out the more responsible, like people, you say intuitive eating and people take the piss out of it, but it's like the legitimate place of intuitive eating. And it's been very cool to sort of see like that, and then how that weaves in with bodybuilding, and sort of realizing that even a sport such as bodybuilding, which is like commonly known that I would say it's not the healthiest sport to embark on if you're actually going to compete. Like, it's very hard to argue that it's conducive to health, but it's cool to see that across the board, most people are being a little bit more sort of mindful of like, okay, long term, what are the implications of this? Is this useful long term? What are the drawbacks to just living that like macro bodybuilding lifestyle?
Yeah, I'd agree completely. And I think the only way that I could see, and I love bodybuilding too. I never competed, but that's what sort of kickstarted my whole journey in this space, because I got interested in bodybuilding because I had to put on muscle for rugby, right? So basically, when I was at high school, the coaches of the first 15 said, if you can put on X amount of weight, you'll captain the first 15. If you don't put on the weight, you won't even play. You'll be in the second 15 because you're too small. And so that was a decision I had to make. I got into it, and as is my way, I discovered everything I could about hypertrophy within that short amount of time. I read, got textbooks out from the library, and I read everything I could. This as well as at high school, and basically discovered all that I could about hypertrophy. But the only way that I think bodybuilding can actually be healthy in the long term is if people take the approach that their form follows function. If they're taking the approach that I need to be the healthiest I can be, or I need to have that foundation of health, and then that will express itself in the way that I look. And sure, there's going to be specific ways to train and eat and things like that, but the overriding focus needs to be health. Otherwise, quite frankly, the health span of that individual will be shorter.
Exactly. Yeah.
And again, I don't think that's a controversial thing to say. And I think that's something that has come back, to my mind at least. It seems like it's come back a lot into bodybuilding, where it was lost for a while.
Yeah, I would agree. It's like, for me, simply, there's been two things. Just learning and applying two variables has been like literally 90% of it. So for me, I'm like an individual who very prone to injury. I can't tolerate much volume if the intensity is very high. So literally all I had to learn was reps in reserve still works, and like manage volume and don't do dumb shit. And it's like literally just those things. And now it's like, I'm not chronically injured. It's just pretty, it's shit to be chronically injured. So it's like, learn those things and then take a much more, it can be a much more reasonable approach. But yeah, I would say completely agree.
I think there needs to be a long-term vision there as well. And that long-term vision has to be a long-term vision of health and resilience. Now, I know the word resilience gets a lot of shit nowadays as well, but I think it's a good one, because if we create the ability over time to be more resilient to workload, we build our work threshold, and you don't do that straight away. You don't jump into suddenly doing 90-minute sessions with really heavy load and all that kind of stuff. No, you're going to build up incrementally. Yeah. You build your resilience to work threshold. You build your resilience through providing the substrate that you need, programming the software of your body by doing the right things for genetic expression, getting enough sleep, all these various factors. That basically then provides for the foundation by which we're able to function most effectively. Yeah. Now, I've been talking about that a lot lately with Chris Miller from Primal Phoenix and Mike Huffam, who you may know. I think he's New Zealand's best kettlebell guy. Darren Ellis is the godfather of CrossFit in New Zealand. We're all sort of getting a little bit older now. We're all middle-aged men in our 40s. And I think we've all independently come to the conclusion that a lot of what we did through, let's say, our 20s and 30s, a lot of it was actually maintaining our movement ability that we had from when we were kids and teenagers. Right? We were getting a lot stronger because we're often, in sports that involve strength, but maybe we were actually detraining some of our ability to move laterally or to have improved mobility, to have that sort of work threshold that you have as a kid running around probably doing 20 or 30,000 steps a day kind of thing. but also not always being consistent with those other things. You make compromises, as I'm sure you did when you're studying, as I did when I was studying. We don't always get enough sleep. We don't always eat as well as we could. And we don't need to be perfect, but what we certainly need to do is most things right most of the time.
Yeah.
In order to then, create this foundation. The reason I went tangential there a little bit is because, probably similarly to you, I have really struggled through the years with chronic pain. And that was as a result, supposedly, of weightlifting injuries and things, shoulder injuries, low back injuries, where I pretty much blew out 2 of my discs in my lumbar spine. But here's the thing. If the pathology was the only thing, then I would be debilitated like I was for a long time, every day and consistently.
Yeah.
But hey, lo and behold, when I'm eating really well and taking some intelligent supplementation and sleeping well, moving through varied planes of motion and staying strong, I'm relatively pain-free. So it's not just about the pathology always driving the outcome, particularly when it comes to pain and immobility.
I completely agree. I think pain is such a complex thing. Like, especially now that we're learning more about pain science, it's fascinating how, like, and like the demographic of people with scoliosis, it's like there's a lot of, I used to make YouTube videos about scoliosis, and they've got like lots of comments from people with scoliosis, and it's all very sort of fatalistic. There's no future. There's nothing I can do. And it's very hard to see, because it's like, I know for myself, I never thought I could be pain-free. Like, I was in pain before I started exercising. And then it's like, now I've started, living the healthiest life I can without disrupting everything else that I do. And it's like, I don't do that much. Like, I reckon I could maintain where I'm at right now by not doing as much as I think I need to do,
Yeah.
I eat pretty healthy. I generally do a good amount of exercise, good amount of just walking, good amount of lifting. Although I did know, you mentioned the inability to sort of move laterally. Like a year ago, I played a game of touch, and seriously, I was sore for like a week.
Yeah.
Like, I literally couldn't move the day after. It was like, it made me realize, like, holy shit, if I literally just train for bodybuilding and do nothing else, that does have repercussions if I try and I went hard at the game of touch for some reason. I just really gave it my all, but it's like, I was fucked. Like, I just had absolutely, like, I hadn't had that much DOMs in literally years. And it was just like one game of touch, and everything was sore for a long time. And it's just like, it's crazy, my inability to play touch. When back in the day as a kid, you could go and do it all the time. But yeah, I'll guide it back to what we were going on. So one thing that I thought was really cool is sort of your ability to say, hey, there is limitations here. Would you be able to sort of go into some of those limitations in terms of the general population? So when I say general population, generally someone who's seeking health. They're not seeking high performance. They're not seeking to be super jacked. They're not seeking that. They're seeking primarily a healthy, holistic sort of lifestyle. In terms of applying a low carbohydrate or a carb appropriate diet for these kind of people, what sort of limitations do you think it has for these kind of people?
Well, in terms of I'm going to be a little bit facetious here. In terms of a carb appropriate diet, there's no limitation really, because a carb appropriate diet could be, high, moderate, low carb. But in terms of a low carb or a keto diet, I think the major limitation is that the person can't stick to it. Because empirically, I'd say we'd have to say that there's no clear downside to following a low carb diet. Ceteris paribus, all other things being equal, it's not going to be a problem, right? And what I mean by that is that if we have 2 diets that are based around natural and processed food, and one is higher in carb and one is lower in carb, then assuming people can moderate how much they eat or modulate how much they eat, the effect size between them is going to be very similar. There could be some advantages for low carb and keto if you're wanting to lose more body fat. Even though people say that those effect sizes narrow over time, they do, but I still think even in the long term, there are persistent advantages for glucose control and for anthropometry in terms of body fat loss from low carb or keto. However, if you were wanting to gain muscle, then there's going to be some benefit from increased carbohydrate in the diet. Similarly, if you wanted to perform well as an athlete, then you might be anywhere between keto, low carb, moderate carb, high carb. The main thing is that within any of those paradigms, the carb content is going to be higher the more active you are. So you might be on a higher carb variation of keto. You might be on a higher carb variation of a low carb diet, if that makes sense, or a higher carb variation of a high carb diet. What I basically mean there is that baseline plus, so, baseline high carb is going to be a proportion of your diet comes from carbohydrate, but the more you exercise, the more that goes up. Same thing with a keto diet. You might be on a baseline of very low carbohydrate, but then if you need to perform at a higher level, doing high intensity activity and a relatively high volume of that, you can just incrementally increase your carbohydrate to meet that, and you might still be in ketosis. So really the major limitation is the psychosocial aspect of nutrition, and what people can stick to is going to be far and away the most important factor there for a general population. Obviously, when we talk about pathology, then there might be specific types of diet that are going to be better or worse for particular outcomes.
Boom. Yeah, I think, it would be really cool if everyone in nutrition had such a sort of like, I guess you would call it not just evidence-based, but like a reasonable approach to things. Very cool to hear. Like, it's kind of like, there's no generalizations. There's no kind of like, there's no trickery. Like, it's really cool. It's just cool to see.
The problem is it doesn't sell so many books, right? You've got to have the clickbait. You've got to have the controversy when you take a reasonable approach.
Yeah, that's the thing though. It's like, that's what I always think. Like, I could just, being like a young 21-year-old, right? So I have this story where I've got a chronic condition, right? And I gained a bunch of muscle. Like, I used to be 50 kilos. Now I'm like 75. So it's like, if you do that in a snapshot on a thumbnail on YouTube, you can get a shit ton of views. And I know I've done it somewhat before, but it's like, I know I could do it way more now, and I could just totally milk it. But it's like, it's kind of just like, I don't think long term it's good to go down that path. Like, I'd much rather be like, okay, I know my morals are all good. I'm not lying to anyone. I'm not cheating with anyone. It's like, everyone knows exactly what they're getting. Like, I struggle to understand how people, like, the main thing I talked about with Stefan was basically his company Red Pen Reviews. We sort of talked about how fucked nutrition books can be, and like how bad they can be, and how just wrong and like objectively just false and objectively terrible, like objectively lying straight to people's faces, and there's no one checking them. So it's like, I'd much rather morally and like just for a good life be on the side of reasonable, rational evidence and doing things that I know it's not as sexy, but shit works. And it's like, I don't want to be on the side that's making this shit worse, Like, I'm sure you're the same. Like, you've made this your career. You've done it in a reasonable, fair, honest way. Yeah. It's like, I couldn't even fathom being on the other side. I couldn't sleep at night. Like,
I think we have a real challenge at the moment in that things are driven by eyes on a web page, right? So we have clickbait, we have things that are designed to elicit controversy. They're designed to elicit, emotions like anger in the viewers, and people play into that. The web becomes very much a shouting gallery, between people. And I think one thing we all need to do is be a little bit more gentle in our approach to others and recognize that, hey, people make mistakes. And yes, there are people out there who blatantly peddle bullshit. And I'm not saying they shouldn't be called on their bullshit, but we should be approaching the issue and not necessarily attacking the person. I'm a real advocate for removing ad hominem, argumentum ad hominem, attacking the person. Yeah. And a really good example of that, I posted my team reposted an article that I wrote ages ago, just recently. And in it, I talked about how, snacking through the day can lead to perpetual increase in insulin, which might reduce the ability to lose fat. Now, a lot of people challenged that and they said, no, it's bullshit because the whole insulin hypothesis is basically wrong. And I jumped online immediately and said, you know what? It's an older article. I might have jumped the shark a bit on this, right? And I'm sure Stefan and others would agree that I've probably jumped the shark a little bit. However, what I also said in this thread is that to some degree the jury's still out, because I wasn't saying in the article that this perpetual small increase in insulin is going to drive fat gain. What I was saying is that it might inhibit our ability to lose fat, to liberate fat. And this is something that's been observed clinically, which needs further study, right? But I accept that I could be incorrect and I might have jumped the shark. But substantively, what I was saying in the article was basically, I don't think most people should snack. I think people should eat meals until they're full and have a decent lag time between meals. But it was really cool because I didn't attack, even though, you know, some people were being a little bit contrary, shall we say. It started a really cool discussion where people were saying, well, you know, for some of my patients, snacking does work. I say, absolutely. I'm not saying for everybody. Some of my bariatric surgery patients, basically, they need to have smaller, more frequent meals. Meals being the operative word, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so we went on this bit of a rant, and then it was really cool because eventually someone jumped on board and said, you know, this is really cool to see. This is what conversations on Twitter should be like. Because it was very civil, it was courteous. You know, we were talking about the issue and where we might, you know, disagree, where we might have failings and things like that. And I think everyone came out of the conversation better off.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Like, rather than you suck because.
And just being, I think that I'm glad that the call out culture is getting smaller and smaller. It seems like, or we kind of realize now, like calling someone out without letting them defend themselves is, I would say, objectively pretty wrong. And it's like, even if their views are dangerous, like call out the idea, don't call out the person. And it's like, you can say something is incorrect without saying, and fuck this person. Like, it's literally, there's like a bunch of names you could say right now and you know everyone would be like, fuck that guy. It's just and I don't know, I just think I've learned a lot of it from Eric. Like, he was the first one who sort of opened my eyes to it. Like, don't call people out. Like, it's not as clickbaity and you won't get as many views if you just actually respond to the idea in a logical and like reasonable and evidence-based way. But it's like, it's just a much more moral thing to do. It's not, you look better long-term, I think, responding to ideas, not giving people ad hominem attacks. It's like, it's just like, I can't see the utility or the honor. It's just, I don't know if it's just dishonorable. I also think it's like it's like logically an issue.
Yeah, no, I think although, you know, the idea of virtue signaling, I think, is overused as well, because people attack, you know, using the metric of virtue signaling and say, oh, you're just virtue signaling. I think that certainly is a reality that a lot of people will attack in order to appear more virtuous for whatever reason. Now, at the end of the day, I think anyone who's pragmatic gets to a point in their life where they realize that doesn't matter. You know, I would say that, of course, we all have ego and we all become arrogant about certain things. I do, everyone does. But I do feel pretty comfortable that I don't really care too much about my supposed position in the industry or in academia or whatever. I just literally want to put out good content at the best that I can at the time, completely aware that some of it is going to be incorrect and I'm going to make mistakes. But also to continue learning, right? And that's the important thing. Like, that's one of the reasons why I think, you know, Eric and I, when we met many years ago, became firm buddies, because we disagreed on probably a fairly large amount of things, but we agreed on the important things. And we also agreed on the most important concepts, which is that, hey, we're all here to learn and we can probably come to agreement on the most important things most of the time and all be better as a result. Yeah.
And exactly. There's no like inherent disrespect. Like, I think I remember back when I first started doing all this stuff, I was I was that angry little 20-year-old who was just sort of like, I would just get mad all the time. Be like, fuck, but calories, guys, but calories. And it's just like, come on, mate. Like I don't have anything in nutrition. All I've done is talk to smart people about nutrition. And it's just like, it's just ridiculous.
I've been there. I've been practically vegan. I wasn't 100% vegan, but I was vegetarian, mostly vegan, mainly because I didn't at the time have a lot of dairy because I've got, autoimmune inflammatory stuff, and I don't really eat a lot of eggs because I don't like them. So I was basically vegan for that reason for many years. And I was, I would say, an activist. I was trying to convince everyone as to the reasons why they should also be vegan. Obviously I became involved in keto and low carb and whatnot. And I don't think I was ever completely zealous about that, but I've certainly had my moments of zealotry. And even with training, I remember I was laughing about it the other day because I don't do a lot of squatting anymore. And many years ago, Mike Boyle, who at the time was a very well-known strength coach out of the States, wrote an article which got a huge amount of attention saying that, athletes don't need to squat. And we were all like, dude, what the fuck are you talking about? Everyone should squat, and they should squat heavy, and they should squat ass to the ground. And if you don't, you're basically not training. And now I kind of think, what a ridiculous standpoint to take. It was very much machismo.
Yeah.
You've got to do these particular things, otherwise you're not a real lifter. And now with more of a long-term health focus as to just wanting to be the strongest dude that I could be, I kind of realized that exercise selection is fairly arbitrary.
Yeah.
As long as you're putting your body under load and you're getting consistently enough volume and you're moving in different planes. I mean, man, I feel a heck of a lot better through introducing a greater variety of movement patterns and planes within my training over the last couple of years.
I would agree. It's kind of like, I think people like to put, and it's very common, especially in bodybuilding, people will put exercises on a pedestal and they'll make exercise selection seem like this magically crucial thing. But it's just like, it's just not. Like, it's just one of the things that's way far down the pillar compared to things like just manage your volume, like train appropriately. Like, it's like way down there instead of putting like, okay, you have to do cable flies and you have to do them with cuffs on. And if you don't, it's not nearly as good as anything else. It's just like, it's just elitism.
The thou shalt nots as well, I think, are equally damaging. And that could be nutrition, it could be lifestyle, it could be exercise. Don't ever do sit-ups because they're bad for your back. I'm like, hold on, sometimes I've got to sit up because I do catch wrestling and Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and I get up from my bed and all this kind of stuff. And I get it that excessive volume of certain things, particularly if you're not strong, and particularly if you've got mobility issues and blah, 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 all these other things, could be problematic. But as soon as it becomes an absolute, like, don't ever do sit-ups, otherwise you're practically going to die. It makes no sense. Just like, don't ever eat sugar because it's poison. Well, empirically, we know that sugar's not poison. And even if it were, dose defines the poison.
Yeah, exactly.
Arsenic, for example, is probably an essential trace nutrient. The thing is, it's such a minuscule amount we need. We would never want to take in any more than we naturally would from our environment incidentally.
Yeah.
But hey, it doesn't mean that arsenic as an absolute is going to kill you. Any more than a normal physiological intake will be damaging to you.
It's just kind of like, I think it's been really cool I think I've been really lucky that the podcast led to this kind of community. Like, it's the community where people, the general gist of it is like, don't throw absolutes everywhere. That's like just the general, I'm still trying to sort of figure out exactly what you would call it, but because it's not like calling yourself evidence-based in itself, I think, is an issue. And like, people have had a few good conversations about that. And it's kind of, I don't know what you would call it, but it's like, and I think even making it a community is an issue.
Yeah.
But it's like, just this general idea of like, don't have all these logical fallacies and like thought trips that just really make your thoughts dogmatic or whatever. It's just like, have logical thoughts, debate with each other in a nice, open and fair way. And like, you just get to better ideas. It's just, I don't know. It
Absolutely.
just seems highly logical. Like, I feel very lucky to have gotten down that path.
I think the term that I use is pragmatic, a lot. I'd consider myself well, maybe I don't consider myself. I strive to be a pragmatist.
Hmm.
You know, strive to sort of see balance, recognize limitations, and that also, we could also say that is science at its heart.
Yeah.
You know, people that say, oh, you know, we shouldn't investigate that because it's obviously kooky.
Hmm.
I would say if there's something that seems kooky, we should investigate it.
Yeah.
You know, we're going to discover something. It could be that all of the early investigation shows that it is completely wacky and it's not something we want to pursue any further, but we've got to do the work, right? And I think any legitimate scientist has to be a pragmatist.
Yeah.
Right? Because the scientific method is purely one of wondering, creating a hypothesis of what you believe will happen, testing it, and being prepared to be wrong in your hypothesis.
I completely agree. I think it's just one of the most beautiful things, science. It's kind of like, in its purest form, it's one of the things where it's very hard to argue with true, like, objective science. Like, it's just like, it's fair. There's nothing that you're like, you know, there's no biases. Like, obviously it's not possible, but it's like, you know, it's just the idea of that is so beautiful. It's just, obviously there's a few things that get in the way sometimes, but it's like, I don't think we have a better tool. Like, it's just it's the best tool we have. It's like you compare communism and capitalism, right? And you have like, okay, ideally communism is fantastic, but it doesn't work. So it's like, we should probably be capitalist. So it's like, you know, I mean, I don't want to get into politics, but you know, it's like, it's just like generally assumed knowledge, you know, it's just like, people will argue against science and they'll, like, I've had many people, I don't want to keep bagging on the same people. I've mentioned it before, and it's not specific names. It's just people in institutions where I'm like, they'll say things like basically saying all science is corrupt. You shouldn't really trust science, but it's just, it's like, okay, what tools should we use then? Like anecdotes, just pure anecdotes. Like, no, it's just
it's a logical fallacy in and of itself. It's like saying, you know, the dude who was digging your garden cut through your power cable and now you don't have any power in your house. So, you know, all spades should be banned because that's the problem, right? Science is a method. Science is a tool. And people are corrupted by power. You know, they're corrupted by the desire for power, which expresses through things like money or fame or whatever it happens to be, credibility, visibility. Can you hear that playing?
Yeah, it's okay. Don't worry.
So, you know, people are corrupted by that desire for power. And of course, that's going to influence anything. And whether that's the write-up of a scientific article or maybe some collusion or, you know, nefarious influences, whatever it happens to be. But on balance, most scientists are doing good work and most of them are trying to do it with integrity. Now, what people need to understand is that science is simply a method and there are different ways to get to the same sort of outcome or different ways to get to an outcome. So within a particular study, you know, the methodology that's used, the analysis that's used, and then the conclusions that are drawn are going to be different if a different scientist had performed the study. It doesn't invalidate the study. And that's one thing that really annoys me is, you know, I've posted up a couple of studies in various studies that we've performed in various groups. And people have jumped on board and said, oh, well, you didn't do this in your study, therefore the conclusions are worthless. I'm saying, well, that wasn't the study we did. If we had have used those methods that you propose, that would have been a different study and it would have been interesting. But we didn't do that study. We did a different study using these methods and this analysis, and these were our conclusions. It doesn't invalidate the study. It just means that there's another piece of the puzzle. Now, I think a lot of that stems from this idea that people have that a study is going to be the answer. A study is never the answer. A study merely adds a leaf on a branch, on a tree, in a forest. That helps us to understand a little bit more.
That's a really good analogy. Like, it's just like, it's a tiny piece of this puzzle. Like, it's for someone who wants to go into science, it's sort of, it's strange because I'm like, research, you can like really change stuff. But then it's like, well, if you're doing research correctly, it's just a piece of the puzzle. And yeah, I find
it can still be very impactful.
Yeah, that's,
it can be very influential. And I think any piece of information that's added is of value. And as a researcher, it's fascinating because there are so many areas that have not been looked at. I was blown away when I did my master's research on, we looked at keto flu a lot, and there have been literally no studies that had actually quantified. Now there've been a lot of studies that have looked at adverse effects arising from a keto diet, but none of them had quantified a few very important things like keto flu. What it actually meant in terms of quantifying the magnitude of keto flu and the various symptoms, how long they lasted, even things like how long it takes to get into nutritional ketosis. No one had really looked at that. A lot of studies have said, well, it took our participants this long to get into ketosis, but the measures they use, the numbers they use were all different. In terms of the standardized understanding that we now have in clinical nutrition of what nutritional ketosis actually is, there was basically no research. So I was blown away as an early career researcher because it's like, well, this is stuff that I thought was foundational. No one studied it. So we could actually provide some interesting information here. Did we answer the questions unequivocally? Of course not. But did we add some really interesting stuff that can now be built upon? Absolutely. And that's really cool to know that you're actually providing something of value to the whole.
Yeah. Like to me, it's like if I could, for me, I'm so passionate myself. Like what I really want to research is hypertrophy and then hypertrophy for diabetes. And it's like, if I can make 1% difference in the utility of that and finding out if it's even useful, it's like, that's fucking good enough for me. Like, I feel like the kind of people who want to get into research aren't doing it, well, commonly aren't doing it for like, I want to make fast change really quick because they realize that's not how change happens. It's just like tiny increments of change add up. It's like compound interest.
Yeah.
Like, if you know compound interest, it's just magic. It's fucking magic over a long time. So it's
it also needs to get out there. And I think that's what we're seeing now is that there are scientists who are certainly getting the work out more effectively. I think we're starting to see, practitioner researchers who are very well known, who have, a large following. You look at, guys like Eric Helms. Who was I thinking of here? Brett Contreras.
Yeah, or like Chris Beardsley or something.
Who have a huge amount of followers. And consequently, I'm sure that their translation from their research is far more impactful, but even their research may be read a lot more than the standard paper. It used to be back in the old paper days that the average scientific paper would be read by 6 people.
Damn.
That's growing, thankfully, because of the internet, but it's still very low. In some fields it's higher, but we were really proud of the fact that our I think one of the articles you read, some of our articles in PeerJ have been read, 10,000 odd times, and we're in the top 5 for their category in their particular years. That's almost more important to me than any of the vanity metrics like citation numbers and things like that, because although those are important because then the work is being impactful across academia. If lay people are reading it as well and actually getting something valuable from it, then that's really important.
Even if practitioners read it and then they distribute that information, it's like, that's what's really cool. Like it's really, like for me, like, so I've got this stack of papers on my desk, right? And it's like, just reading, like reading all these, sorry to the trees. But
it looks as big as my doctoral thesis, right?
That's like 20 papers there. But it's just like, as someone who's like, I don't have my PhD in this, I don't understand everything that's going on there, or even a lot of it, but it's like reading that and seeing, okay, here's like the most full, honest like picture you can get that's not sort of like made with a little bit of marketing thrown in there. It's really cool because you're just getting the picture. You're not getting like, and by my program, like there's none of that. Like it's not like it's not clouded by anything, which I think is just the purest form of education. I mean, it's hard to pick out like, how is that useful to me? Is that not useful to me? Does that apply to this situation? Making sure that I don't misinterpret it, which is the difficult part. I think it's one of the things I've really enjoyed doing recently is literally just reading research and just taking my time with it and not just assuming from the headline, like trying to take the whole context for what population and what situation, what did they do, what variables did they do. Very difficult at the start, but it's slowly gets easier, but it's still very difficult because it's complex papers.
And there are movements that are helping with that too, I think. One in particular, we had a lot of discussions about this because I think you can become very academically minded when you're writing up your papers and you write in a very dry style. Now, there obviously has to be an academic writing style, but it doesn't need to always be as inaccessible as it is. We can use less jargon, and we shouldn't use jargon unless it's necessary. We can use less acronyms, and we should, again, only use acronyms where they're necessary, where they actually help with the reader to have flow and consistency. And also from there, we're getting really cool things. There often are lay summaries and key points provided even in the scientific journals. We have, a lot of really good people out there doing research reviews as well. Obviously, Eric and the guys with their mass review. I do my little carb appropriate review every month. There's a lot of people who are translating the science, and it's not biased by conflicting interests per se. It's not like you say you read a research review and it's and by my program.
Exactly.
It's more so this is the thing you've bought, right? So there doesn't need to be a vested interest because it is what it is. And that's another movement that's coming in as well. I think people are getting back to paying a small amount for quality content rather than it having to be clickbait to drive advertising.
Exactly. It's like with mass, it's like you're only ever going to find objective, non-biased reviews in there because they're not trying to sell you their program at the end of the thing, because what you're buying is the product. And it's like you're buying effectively like, here's something complex, distilling it down a little bit, taking what they think is the correct interpretation of it and then making it consumable. And it's it's damn cool the way science is going. Like, it's just really cool to see people respecting science and realizing general public seem to be respecting it a little bit more in general, I'd say, which is cool. I mean, not in all circles, but in a lot of circles, it's like the thing where it's like, okay, we know this works pretty damn well, which is cool.
I think so. And I think, it's interesting to me that some certain scientists are very well known now, even maybe in specific communities, but in what we'd consider relatively mainstream communities. You talk to anyone involved in the keto community, even if they're a complete layperson about, let's say Dom D'Agostino, they know who he is. Right. And that's cool. And he's, even though he's, obviously an advocate for keto, and so he has some detractors, I think most people across the board, most academics, most scientists say, Dom knows his stuff about ketones. Right. And that's rad because he's become almost like a rock star in his particular field.
It's like, I find it fascinating. Someone like Joe Rogan, right? It's like, he has no formal education in this, and I'd say he's had some bad information on. Like, I'd say at some times he hasn't put the best stuff out there, but it's like he's had a lot of good debates on there. He's had a lot of good people on. It's like it's cool because it's like now the layperson can kind of see that in action. Like, Joe's literally learning on the show. It's just like, and I mean, there's a lot of bias there. Like, whatever. It's like, it's not the perfect like portrayal of nutritional education, but it's like, it's not terrible. Like, it's not the worst in the world. I think it's almost controversial to say that, I'd say.
I think on balance, it's actually pretty good. For a couple of reasons. I think that across a broad range of topics, he gets some of the very best guests he could. Now, whether it's always, it's not completely unbiased all the time, but he does also get disparate viewpoints. And I think legitimately he's one of the best interviewers out there.
100% agree. Like, it's like he has the ability to get the best in the world on, and sometimes he gets it wrong who is the best, but it's like he lets them talk. He for instance, you look at the debate with Stefan and Gary Taubes, and it was like
Gary Taubes,
they're letting everyone talk. Everyone's allowed to talk, and it's like, I posted a thing on my Instagram yesterday. I was like, should we let everyone have a seat at the table to talk about anything. Say if you have two people that want to have a debate, one's everyone pretty much agrees white supremacists are pretty bad. We all kind of agree that Nazis are bad, right? And then whatever the opposite of that is, I think it's like we should let them talk, right? But then have someone on the other side who says, no, this is pretty bad. Here's why it's bad. Like, maybe that's a really extreme example, but it's the most extreme example you can give, I guess. Like,
I think it's a good example because the topic of deplatforming is a big one.
Yeah.
I personally am very much in favor of complete freedom of speech.
Yeah.
However, I think that there are instances, for example, when when companies have said to particular speakers, you know what, we don't actually want you to speak at our venue anymore.
Right, yeah.
I think that's also them exercising their freedom as well to not have that person. Like when Jordan Peterson's book was pulled from Whitcoulls here in New Zealand.
Yeah, yeah.
Everyone, was up in arms about it, saying it was an infringement of his free speech and all this kind of stuff. Notwithstanding, we don't actually have that right here in New Zealand per se. We don't have the First Amendment. But what I saw that was as a company exercising their right to not stop a particular book. Now, if people want to buy his book, and I'm sure it drove a lot of people to buy his book, that's great. Do I agree with his stance on a lot of things? Absolutely not. Do I agree with his stance on some things? Yes. Was I interested to hear him on the Joe Rogan podcast? Absolutely. Because it's a disparate viewpoint.
Yeah. It's just, I don't know. I think there's no reason. I think definitely like a company like that, they should have the right to limit whatever they're allowed. Like they're basically like a distributor of voices. They should be allowed to pick who they let talk, like through their voice, through their company, right? It's like, and I would agree pretty accurately with your viewpoint. Like it's kind of like the company shouldn't have to let them do that, but it's like, I get why people were mad, but it's like, he does have controversial views. So it's like, if they don't want to associate with that, fair enough. Like, and it's, I would agree pretty spot on. I think every time he's brought up, he's a controversial topic. No matter who you talk to, everyone's got an opinion on him. And I find it's very rarely like a sort of like, oh, I agree with some stuff and I don't agree with other stuff. And I feel like that's with everything that should probably be most of the time, that's the most appropriate response. Like, as you said, like, it's kind of like some of the stuff he says, I think is really cool. Like, great. But then other stuff, I'm like, whoa, calm the fuck down. Like it's, that should be with everyone. Like with Joe Rogan, right? It's like, he says a lot of cool shit, a lot of really not cool shit. And it's like, I think it's just the most reasonable, the most, what was that word? Pragmatic way to approach it. Like if you just say someone's a Nazi and then don't take anything else they say and then say, we shouldn't even let them talk, we should ban them from the country. It's like, well, I would say I genuinely disagree. They should be allowed to talk, but it's just like, then we should have someone on the other side who says, well, that's not quite true. And just the truth, usually, if everyone gets to talk and we let science run the way or logic run the way, generally, I think the truth comes out, or what the closest interpretation of the truth might be.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we've gone on a few tangents, which I think is quite fun. But should we end it off here? Cliff, where can people find you? If people want coaching from you, where can they go? I believe you have a podcast, you have a blog. Where can people find all that sort of stuff? Yeah,
so the podcast, blog, my coaching, and my carb appropriate review can all be found at cliffharvey.com. And from there, you can obviously link out to my social, my Facebook and whatnot. And we also have the Holistic Performance Institute at holisticperformance.institute. And that's where people can learn from myself and Eric Helms and others. We have continuing education programs in nutrition coaching, a full nutritionist program. Eric teaches research skills for practitioners, which is pretty rad. We've got a bunch of other courses on the science behind ketogenic diets and things like functional mycology, which is the use of mushrooms as supplements as well.
Yeah, I saw that. That looks very, very interesting.
It's a new one because I'm really into mushrooms as supplements, and I realize that there's very little translational education for that. So there's very little for people to actually discover more about how to use them, safety, toxicity, dosage, all that kind of stuff. And so given that I've been working with them clinically for quite a while, and I've done a fair bit of, reading and education around them, coming from the naturopathic background and then moving into nutrition and whatnot, we thought we'd put that together and put it out. So just come out now, and that's proving to be pretty popular.
Oh, yeah, Hey guys, thank you very much for listening to this episode. I hope you give us a review or you really enjoyed the episode. Let me know any feedback. I'm always open to any criticism, anything like that. Reach out to me on Instagram at James_Walsham, or if you'd like to follow my business account, follow at the Hypertrophy Hub. Thank you guys so much for listening. If you would like to help the show, there's a list of ways to do so in the show notes, but if you're wondering how, the best thing to do is just give us a review on iTunes or just let me know how the show can be improved. Thank you very much.